live peaceably with all people. And this, of course, even more important with your spouse because you live with them for the rest of your life and you live in the same
Sure.
house.
Yes.
You're together. So if
Peaceably.
possible,
Yes.
so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with your spouse. A way to guarantee that you will not live peaceably with your spouse is blaming them for your anger.
Boom.
You may be one choice away from a thriving marriage. Welcome to the Operation Thriving Marriage podcast with Brian and Jennifer Harvey.
So welcome to the Operation Thriving Marriage podcast. So, sweetheart, what makes you angry?
Oh, goodness. Lately, I've been getting really, and I don't want to say crazy angry, but really miffed lately at people who are just seemingly thoughtless and unaware of their surroundings. Like, we had the ability to go to New York City and see some pretty cool Broadway shows. And I felt like every show that we went to, people were just very inconsiderate of those around them. Like we were at a show where the guy that sat down next to you smelled like he had been smoking pot for like hours before the show. And then a guy that sat next to me during a show was munching on beef jerky the entire time. And then
all these pleasant smells while you're trying to watch a show. Yeah, this is fantastic.
Exactly. And then you've got, the kid behind you who's consecutively like kicking your seat. And I'm not blaming the kid, I'm blaming the parents for that. So it's like the parents aren't just like tuned out, not even aware of what their kid is doing for that kind of thing. Or, being on an airplane and, somebody's, kind of like grabbing your seat and jerking it around, or they've got their knee in your back, just stuff like that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The things that will incite our anger or things that will create the context for anger to happen, right? That can be a struggle in marriage, right?
Sure.
I mean, it can be a big struggle. One of the things that's difficult, though, is anger itself is, it's pretty much unavoidable. Anger's going to happen, and it's not anger that's the problem in anyone's marriage. The anger itself, it's how we handle our anger is really what the problem is.
And that's something that I had heard in a class that I took in middle school where it's like, emotions aren't per se good or bad, they just are, but it's like, what are you going to do with that emotion? How are you going to manage that? How are you going to process it? It's almost like the emotion is something that was to an extent out of your control because maybe you were triggered by something or just however you're experiencing that emotion, but then it's like, okay, it's in your court. What are you going to do with it?
Yeah, you feel something and you label it some way. What do you do about it? One of the problems, though, that we've seen, I know you've seen this a lot when you used to do family law cases, is a spouse blaming their spouse for their anger.
Oh, absolutely. You make me so mad when you, right?
Yeah, it's your fault. Something will happen and one spouse will get angry. And like you said, in their head, they're thinking, my spouse made me angry. You made me angry. And then you'll say, you make me angry when you whatever.
Just in so doing, to me, that harkens back to Genesis. It's like, God, that woman you put in the garden with me, it's like she gave me the apple, so then I ate it. So it was like that was not on me,
not my
God.
fault.
That was on the wife that you put here in here with me. So that's on you, God, too. Which is like, no, it's not, because that Adam, by doing so, was trying to kind of abdicate any kind of responsibility. And just going through these phrases here just about anger, it's like, my spouse made me angry, or you make me so angry when you whatever. The spouse abdicates all responsibility for their own anger, and they just place that blame on the spouse.
And when you do that, now one spouse has put the other spouse in the impossible position of being responsible for resolving the angry emotions in another person.
And how do you do that?
You can't. It's completely impossible.
Because the blamed spouse will, of course, never resolve the anger of the other spouse because they don't have that control over the spouse's emotion. and then they'd likely become angry at this and of course blame their spouse for that anger. So just all of that kind of back and forth there, and it's not helpful, and it can just be so destructive.
Yeah, it creates this cycle. It's like, you made me angry. Well, you made me angry, and then this blame and anger and now shame too, because if I'm responsible for something negative in your life and it's my fault, I love you. I feel bad that I caused this negative thing. And so now I'm feeling shame, as well as all the other feelings, all the other emotions that I'm experiencing because of this situation, whatever it is.
And I think that we can all say, if you know a trigger of your spouse or something that would set them off or get them upset, probably shouldn't poke the bear or, do anything that would cause that, because you're on the same team. You love your spouse. You fail together. You succeed together. You want to succeed. But it is something where ultimately we are responsible for our own emotions and what we're doing with those.
And if we abdicate our responsibility and put it on our spouse, we're just creating an unhealthy, untenable environment in our marriage.
We'd ask ourselves then, what's the solution to this? And I think the first step to stop or prevent that cycle is you got to take responsibility for your own emotions.
100%. 100%.
And of course, your spouse doesn't have control over your emotions. It's always up to you what you're going to do with those. And no matter what your spouse has done, they've never, ever caused you to feel an emotion.
And that's important. No person has ever caused you to feel an emotion. No, your spouse has never caused you to feel emotion, because your emotions are caused by the totality of who you are. Your personality affects your emotions. You and I have very different personalities.
Sure.
And that affects how we emotionally respond to situations. And that's just a reality. Our personalities are genetics.
Mm-hmm.
The fact is, genetics play a big part in how our limbic systems react to stimulus. So that's going to affect our emotions. And then past experiences. Something that happened to me that makes me feel a certain way, you didn't have that experience. And even if you were there, you experienced it differently. So your emotional response to that is going to be different.
And anger can really be incited more so by incidents, not people.
I would say it's always incited by incidents, not people. I don't think people, even the people even the things that you were getting angry about, it wasn't the person, it was what the person did.
Sure.
The person, Bill Bilson, who was sitting next to you eating beef jerky, it wasn't him.
Attention, Bill Bilson, do not bring beef jerky to the theater.
It wasn't him as a person, as the intrinsic qualities of Bill that made you angry. It was his action of eating a beef jerky and releasing that smell into the atmosphere that incited you to anger.
Sure.
He, as a person, just existing doesn't make you angry. What he did. So it's the incidents driving down the road. That person who cut you off, them existing didn't make you angry. The action, the choice they made created the context that incited your anger.
So who your spouse is does not lead you to feel a certain way. What your spouse does instead might create the context for you to feel a certain way.
For instance, spouse walks by and tenderly strokes your shoulder as they walk by, or they buy you a gift, or they clean the bathroom, or they plan a special date, or they compliment you. You respond in a certain way, but it was the action performed by the person that led you to feel that way. There is definitely a relational component, right? I have expectations, you have expectations. We have expectations of the theater that you're not going to walk in and stink because we're going to be sitting next to you for 3 hours.
Right.
So those
that we're not going to get a contact high off of you because you've been smoking marijuana for hours leading up to the show.
So
I'm just saying.
The relational aspect affects it, but it's the action that incited the situation. And so the same is true with actions that create the context for anger. Who your spouse is did not create the context for your anger. Actions done by the person closest to you created the context for you to feel that anger. It's really important that we separate the actions from the person when we're dealing with the emotional realities.
And I would argue then, too, if you're angry by seeing a particular celebrity or a particular politician out there, we are in an election year, you're not angry by just the presence of that person or seeing their picture or their video on the news or on social media. You're mad about things they've done or things that you've been influenced by others to believe that who they are, what they're about in these past actions. It's kind of like if you're dealing with a bully that walks into a room, you would be, you're not nervous by the bully themselves. You're nervous because of what the bully has done in these actions. Fair?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You got to separate those things. And we often say this, but it's core to having a thriving marriage. Emotions are the reaction to stimulus in your limbic system.
Always.
We've got limited control over them. Nobody else has any control over your emotions. Let me say that's really important. We have limited control. How we label what we're feeling, how we think about what we're feeling can affect that emotion. No one else has any control over that emotion that you're experiencing.
But while you only have limited control over your emotions, you have complete control as to how you would then respond to your emotions.
100%.
So I didn't smack the guy with the beef jerky. I didn't grab the pot-smelling guy by the ear and yank him out of the auditorium. I didn't turn around and slap the parents of the kid who was kicking my seat. I behaved, right? So that was a good thing. And I think that we can go back to Ephesians 4 in this. Paul tells us very clearly, be angry and do not sin. So you can get mad, but what are you going to do with it? Are you going to sin in that response to it, or are you not?
Yeah.
Simple as that.
So you have to choose how you respond to the incident that incited your anger. We talk about this. A few things we recommend is first, take a moment to process your emotion. Now, specifically here, we're not talking anymore about the people who are being rude in the theater. We're talking
Right.
about now in your marriage. You are feeling a certain way. There's something going on. Take a moment to process that emotion, to understand what you're feeling and why you're feeling that way. We talk about unplugging.
Right.
And this is a healthy action that every marriage should be comfortable doing. Just, hey, I need a moment. And even just say, hey, I need to unplug for a moment. Use that language so that your spouse knows this isn't storming off in a huff. This isn't, I'm leaving and never coming back. This isn't the silent treatment. That isn't punishment. This is, I need to unplug.
I need a timeout.
Yeah, and process my emotions. Go for a walk, pray, do something that will help calm your body down so you can respond in love. You know, maybe it's going to the gym, maybe it's cooking, maybe it's reading. Something that's just going to allow all of those hormones that your body has produced to even out so that you can now think and respond in a way that's going to be loving and God honoring.
And in that way, you're putting yourself into more of a situation where you're able to respond versus just fly off the handle, react to something.
Right. Yeah.
And that's a wise thing to do. And, you know, when you've taken that time and it's just kind of like when you've come back to yourself, when you've kind of come back to your senses from them instead of operating on emotion, you're then able to take this next step, which is explaining to your spouse, well, when this happens, when this incident happens, whatever that is, I'm now saying I feel angry, I feel sad, I feel disrespected, I feel unloved.
That's a big difference from what we were talking about earlier. It's not, you make me angry when you.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, when this happens, and it can be true. It's like, when you say this,
Mm-hmm.
I feel this way, because the reality is, when you say something to me, it's going to make me feel differently than when someone else does,
Mm-hmm.
because I love you, because of our relationship. And so it's okay to acknowledge the relationship affects how you interpret the action,
Mm-hmm.
because that's just how things are. but the action is what you're angry about, not the person. It's that you make me angry it's like when this happens, I feel, and I love how you brought out, I feel unvalued, unloved. It's not just necessarily anger. There's something, if you can describe more, okay, I'm angry, but what is it that's making me angry? What's the root, the deeper thing that led to that? That's going to be a healthier conversation than just when this happens, I'm angry. Because knowing that, oh, I feel unloved, or I feel insecure, or I feel devalued, that helps your spouse. Okay, I want to interact with you, and I need to, sometimes these types of conversations need to happen, but I need to think of it in a way that is avoiding the devaluing aspect or the unloving or whatever that feeling is. I think that's really important. I thought that was a good thing that you brought up.
And I think that also, it's not blaming, right? It's like nobody's blaming anybody. It's just like, goodness, when this particular incident happens, because I think in some ways it's like when I'm spoken to in this kind of a way, this is kind of what I'm hearing and how I'm feeling about it. And it's a better way to go to have that kind of a conversation, because it's just like, this is on me to be processing and dealing with my emotions, but you need to know that when this happens, this is what's happening with me. So this is how we got to process through this together, again, as this team marriage. And I think a lot of times too, we want to make sure that when we're having these discussions, we have to figure this out in a way that works for both the husband and the wife.
Yeah, it should be a conversation. There should be a back and forth. It shouldn't be, when you snap your fingers 3 times, I feel like you're treating me like a dog, so you just need to stop. Don't ever snap your fingers again. That's dictating, and I was using a silly example, but you don't dictate to your spouse, you will behave this way, or you will refrain from this because I say so, because my precious little emotions can't handle it.
And possibly refraining from certain things, maybe that needs to happen, but that's the conclusion that the couple has to come to together in that mutuality.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not dictatorial. It's, hey, we want to be loving, because the goal is always to strengthen the marriage.
Sure.
The goal is always, how can we be closer? How can we as a couple be more like Jesus? The goal is never change your spouse to be something that you would desire more, or that you want to be different.
Or adjust the behavior. It's just more, how do we come to these kinds of things together? We're not trying to change the spouse to be different, or necessarily even change behavior. It's just that with mutuality, mutual respect, mutual love, mutual caring, how do we handle this kind of a situation that it could be really tough for one spouse, that would make things tough for both of them?
Absolutely. So in Romans, Paul said, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all people. And this, of course, even more important with your spouse, because you live with them for the rest of your life, and you live in the same house.
Yes.
You're together. So if
Peaceably.
possible,
Yes.
so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with your spouse. A way to guarantee that you will not live peaceably with your spouse is blaming them for your anger.
Boom.
You're guaranteed that you're not going to have a peaceable house. Your anger is never your spouse's fault. They can't control your emotions. When you feel anger, take the time to process what led you to feel that way. Then discuss it with your spouse and come together with how we're going to move forward as a couple, so we can strengthen our relationship.
And thank you for joining us for the Operation Thriving Marriage podcast. And please make sure that you rate and subscribe.
Jen and I started Operation Thriving Marriage to help couples and churches take marriages from merely surviving to thriving. We've got our book, we've got a blog, and resources for our coaching ministry, and you can bring us out for an Operation Thriving Marriage experience. For more information, go to OperationThrivingMarriage.com. That's OperationThrivingMarriage.com.